Two competing proposals have emerged to fix the chaos at Rikers Island. Of course, there is a lawsuit that has been ongoing. One side, the inmates, the other side, the city. Each side has proposed a very different proposal as to how to solve this issue, if it can be solved at all. This is Nuance. I'm Mike Scala, joined as always by Jay Carter, also known as Timmy, the hip hop artist in the chair of BLM Tokyo. What's going on with this situation at Rikers, Jay?
Yeah, Rikers has had been a contentious issue for a long time, and as always, we welcome comments. So anyone wants to chip in and chime in, leave them in the comment section below. Subscribe to the channel and like the video as well. Um, yeah, there's a lot.
As always.
Say it again.
No, I'm just making the video public so people can share it. Good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I heard an echo of your voice real quick. So it looks like again, they're making another attempt to try to clean things up over at Rikers.
Yeah, well,
Um,
this has been an ongoing lawsuit. I believe this particular case has been going on for almost a decade now. And there was a New York Times article that came out earlier with some of this information. And the judge is Laura Taylor Swain. She has asked both sides in this lawsuit to submit a proposal for how receivership might look, right? Trying to provide some oversight over the complex here. And as we mentioned, both sides, perhaps unsurprisingly, are asking for very different things, right? The
Right.
lawyers representing the inmates, and I believe that side is led by the Legal Aid Society. They are really looking for broad power with this receiver.
Right.
Society. They're joined by a private law firm that represents incarcerated people. They've also been joined in this by the federal prosecutor's office for the Southern District of New York. So you have a few different parties joined together in this. What they're saying is that this federal receiver would answer only to the court and would have very broad power, including the ability to address union contracts. So that may be a controversial piece of this. They're saying that they want this federal receiver to be able to renegotiate the contracts, even hire and fire people as needed, and answer really only to the court here.
As pointed out in this article, this judge has been monitoring Rikers for like nearly a decade, and things have gotten worse in that time. And it seems like maybe the reforms or the things that were set out weren't being met, and it's still getting worse. So it would make sense that they would answer directly to the court instead of leaving them to their own devices, because they just seem to be unwilling to change or unable to make the changes.
Right. And we should provide the context that the judge previously held the city in contempt of court for its failure to address,
Right,
right, what needed to be addressed as outlined by the court. And so this is, yes,
right.
a drastic remedy, but this is following a contempt of court order. And so now we're at the stage where the judge has to decide, okay, what do we do? Maybe something drastic is needed, to your point there, because the city was found to be in contempt. They were given ample
Right.
opportunity to fix the issues and didn't do so.
Right. And again, this is, as in in the pregame you pointed out repeatedly, this is a jail, not a prison. And there've been 35, according to the article, 35 deaths there since 2022. That's only 3 years, 2 years,
Mhm.
35 inmate deaths. And these aren't people that are sentenced into a prison sentence.
Yeah.
Um, they should not be dying in this facility.
Yes. I mean, I agree with that, but I would like to see more data on that because if you if you were to believe the mayor, right, the mayor has spoken on this. He said that, well, this wasn't the fault, or at least not all of them certainly were the fault of the staff that they were sick. I mean, I think you want to see that. You want to see how they died, what the cause of death were, what the health status was of all these inmates, because I think you might expect with this many people housed there, a certain number are going to die every year, right?
35 and
Well, 35 in what, 3 years, we said?
yeah, that's a lot.
That's also over 10 a year, right?
Yeah. And we're talking about a place they're just supposed to be detained there for a while. It's not supposed to be, you know,
Yeah, well, that is certainly a problem, right? The fact that it is supposed to be a jail where, for the most part, people held there are awaiting their trial. They haven't been convicted. Now, there are some
Right.
who are
So
convicted to
they're not
certain.
even guilty, officially guilty of anything yet.
Right. Some do, right? Some serve short sentences there as opposed to
Sure.
being sent up to prison. But for the most part, it's supposed to be a place to stay pending trial, right?
Right.
Now, we know that the right to a speedy trial is one of the issues that has come up here, right? That there's no way people should be on Rikers Island as long as they are awaiting their trial, and
Right.
especially subjected to these conditions that we see. And so that has
Right.
been really at the forefront of this. I agree. We want to make sure that people can get their day in court sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. So there are obviously serious issues here. And so, like I said, to me, it makes sense that the judge at this point is like, okay, um, you know, they need to answer to the court, instead of leaving them to their own devices to handle this.
Right. Well, okay. So the plaintiff's proposal here, and again, these are the lawyers representing the inmates, right, who are going up against the city.
Right.
They're saying that the receiver should also be able to review, investigate, and take disciplinary or other corrective or remedial actions with respect to violations of DOC, that's the Department of Corrections, policies, procedures, and protocols.
Mhm.
So they, again, are proposing broad power for this receiver to really provide that oversight. The receiver, according to this proposal, would work alongside the monitor and the correction department's commissioner and would be employed at the pleasure of the court, right? And so it will be a court appointed person. And that's significant because if you look at the city's proposal, they're going a different way with this, right?
Right.
They're saying that the receivership will last as long as needed for the city to comply with the terms of the settlement. So some of this does sound reasonable in its terms, right? It will last as long as needed for the city to comply, right? The city is supposed to be doing certain things. If they're not doing them, well, then we're putting this receiver in. And there's also a monitor that was appointed, we alluded to. Steve Martin, I believe his name is. So they're saying, we're looking at keeping these things in place as long as the terms that the city needs to meet are not met. Well,
Yeah.
you contrast that with the city's plan, right? Because the city is proposing a fixed term. But before we even get to that, they don't want to appoint a separate receiver. They actually want to empower the current commissioner of the Department of Corrections with enforcing this, right? With enacting these
Right.
changes or whatever oversight needs to be done. So before we even get to what they're proposing the commissioner does here, it is a little odd, or maybe gutsy is the word, right? That both parties in this case were asked by the court to come up with a plan for how receivership would look. And really, right off the bat, the city seems to be saying, we don't want receivership. We want the current corrections commissioner to just do more stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised at that. They haven't, they haven't met any of the requests or requirements that have been laid out in the past whatever decade that the judge has been monitoring it. So I don't think they're interested in giving up any kind of control for whatever reason, and they're not interested in changing their operating procedure for any reason. So putting the current commissioner in that position allows them to keep doing what they're doing without that outside oversight. And so I'm not surprised at that. I think the other proposal makes a lot more sense to me. Um,
Yeah, so let's finish outlining the city's proposal here, then we can compare and contrast them further.
yeah,
Because the city is saying, and I guess, they're trying to be fair or provide some kind of plan the court might be willing to go with, right? So
right.
they got to make some kind of concession here. So they're saying that the current commissioner, who, by the way, her name is Linnell McGinley Liddy, right,
Right.
should answer to the court on the use of force and safety measures,
Hmm.
But on everything else, she would answer to the mayor. So I guess they're trying to carve out a narrow path here, right? Or a narrow space for the court to have oversight when it relates to
Right.
and safety only, but everything else. Now, again, when we talked about the first proposal, they were talking about giving this federal receiver the ability to hire and fire and make all these different changes. This is obviously looks a lot more narrow. She would answer to the court on the use of force and safety. Everything else would answer to the mayor. The mayor would not be able to remove the commissioner. So that's interesting. Who will be serving in the new role of quote unquote compliance director, right?
Mhm.
But they go beyond that. They're saying that they want this commissioner to be shielded from political influence. And so her job will be guaranteed for 5 years. Now, again, you contrast that with the original plan where they said that these changes would be there as long as the terms of the settlement that was reached earlier were not met, right? Basically, for as long as needed for the conditions to be satisfied. Here, they're saying a guaranteed job for 5 years.
Right. Um, the idea that you don't want there to be any political influence, I think is a good one. We don't want political influence in this situation. However, this guaranteeing it for 5 years when they already have a history of not complying and not making these changes just kicks the can down the road, means things aren't going to be changed for the next 5 years, most likely.
Right.
And
Well,
guaranteeing
at
that this
least,
person stays in place, that
yeah.
means,
I mean, we don't know whether changes would or wouldn't be made, but there's a legitimate concern there, and we do know that if the changes were not satisfactory made, we would kind of be stuck in that situation where you couldn't replace the
right.
person for 5 years, and so what is the
Right.
recourse? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like how you have judges, right? Judges are supposed to be free from political influence.
Right.
That's not always the case, unfortunately, and obviously no system can be perfect, but in theory, judges are supposed to be above the fray. It looks almost like they're trying to take this approach and say this official should be above the political fray. But hold on, they're also saying she answers to the mayor. So how can she be above politics if she answers to the mayor?
Right.
Not a judge. She's not really an independent person who can make her own independent decisions. She answers to the
Right.
mayor under their own proposal. The mayor cannot remove her from office. Okay, she's guaranteed a job for 5 years under this, but she still answers to the mayor, right? I mean, how could you say that that takes away the political considerations? It certainly doesn't take away the political pressure from the mayor.
Right. Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously all an effort to keep local control over Rikers, which this is kind of like that. They want to respect the local laws and the governance versus having this outside influence here. But again, I just there has not changed. Things have only gotten worse, and so I think it's time for outside. I think it's time for this receivership proposal.
Here is my question. If the commissioner here in her new role of compliance director, right, under this proposal, were to be guaranteed her job for 5 years, but would also have to answer to the mayor on everything related to the administration of the jails aside from the use of force and safety. What
Hmm.
if she defied the mayor's orders? She has to answer to the mayor, but she can't be fired. So what happens then?
Right. That's a good question. That is a really good question. So, I mean, I guess nothing then.
So how many?
Like she's still in office or she's still in position and things continue until her term is up.
Yeah. So does she even have an incentive to answer to the mayor?
Right. That's a good question. I'd say probably not. And then the question would then also become what, who does she have incentive to answer to? Or
Mhm.
what agenda
Also,
does she have an incentive to serve?
and to what extent can the mayor override her decisions?
Right. Yeah. So,
So there's also a concern here that the city has articulated about union contracts. And
right.
they're saying that one key difference, obviously, as we mentioned, is the city's proposal doesn't give the compliance director the broad authority over union contracts. And the city is saying that such a power cannot be, this is their quote, justified as necessary to correct constitutional violations. And they're saying here contracts with one municipal union can have a far-reaching impact on the city's relationships and contract negotiations with other municipal unions. And so that could be a valid concern here, that this could interfere with unions, and maybe not even just unions on Rikers, but just city unions in general. If you're giving this one official the ability to renegotiate contracts and to fire people and hire people who are union workers just at will, kind of,
I think
what
it,
long-lasting or far-reaching effects could that have on collective bargaining and union workers' rights?
I I don't think there's enough information here on how this would be applied to really go into it. So I can kind of speculate or give opinion in this regard. I think this is more of a way of the city to try to stop, to stop this from happening by throwing up this fear on this. I would assume that if this receiver, this federal receiver, had that power, they still have to comply with contracts and the law. It's just a different person doing the negotiating other than the city.
Well,
But they'd be doing it on the city's behalf.
yeah,
And I don't think for the unions, as far as what's in place, I don't think that would be an issue. I think what might change is if these contracts are bad and keeping Rikers in the condition that it's in, then they might be a little bit concerned about what's negotiated or what's on the table for negotiation.
yeah. Now, if you just look at the article here in the New York Times, it says that the receiver would still be bound by local law. And so it says
Sure.
they could hire and fire and make changes to staffing, but within the bounds of local law. It doesn't specify, though, if they have to follow union contracts or, is that separate or is that included in their limitations? And so that might be in the 1,000-page plan that, or combined plan, I guess, that came out of the court filing, if you want to look at that a little bit more closely. But right now, since this article just dropped, we're kind of going by what we see in the article here, and it doesn't specify. So to your point, I guess more information would be needed on that. But I think it's a valid concern to raise, or at least to look into, right? You want to make sure that the rights of unions are not being impeded here, and that there aren't far-reaching effects beyond even what happens at Rikers. That's always a concern, and sometimes it's a concern that you don't even realize is a concern. Like I could think back to when I was working in Albany, and I wrote a bill to ensure everyone in the state could get minimum wage. Right. One of the things was, believe it or not, government employees were barred or excluded from the minimum wage law. And so technically, if you worked for the government, you weren't guaranteed a minimum wage. We wanted to
Right.
correct that and say, everyone should be. Well, while the unions were very supportive of the idea of it, they wanted collective bargaining to be part of the legislation.
Hmm.
And it wasn't something I had even considered initially, right? Because you would think, who would be against this, especially unions who want better conditions, better pay, right? Better everything for their workers, right? You would think they would be all for this. But even something like that, they came in and they said, we want to be part of this negotiation, and you want to have some kind of collective bargaining component to the bill. And so I've kind of been mindful, I guess, ever since, even things that maybe on their face seem like great ideas that everyone would get behind, sometimes you may be inadvertently impeding on what the union is trying to do, right? And you need to keep that in
Right.
mind.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm definitely a pro-union guy, especially, former national vice block leader for labor unions out here, and uh, took place in coming up with the demands for the labor offensives. So I get that. I can also understand that there can be situations in which there could be a tradition of ongoing negotiations that can still be bad, right? So some of the things that could be being negotiated could just be going down the wrong path. Um, so I don't think they're going to be impeding.
I get all that. Is there a concern for a federal receiver to be negotiating contracts for the city?
I think under normal circumstances, sure, because you would want a city to have control over its own negotiations and governance. However, we're talking about a situation that is clearly dire and off the rails. I mean, Rikers has been hit with violations and issues going back to the 70s, and things continue to get worse, even with, a judge overseeing it over the past 10 years, and then there's been different sort of situations over the past several decades. You can't just keep bumping your head up against the wall and wondering why you have a headache. So at some point, you might need to do some different measures. So I think, to me, it seems to be one of those times.
Well, you also have to take into account who this person is. Now, under
Which person? Which person?
the receiver, under the plaintiff's plan, right? This person would serve at the pleasure of the court. We don't have a name. We don't know who it's going to be.
Right.
Is it going to come from someone within the federal government? Is the court going to throw up an ad on Craigslist? Who's the person going to be?
That would be an interesting ad on Craigslist.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean that is something to keep in mind. I mean, is it a federally appointed governmental official? Is it someone from the current federal administration?
Right. And I think in that regard, depending on who the person is, you could have a political bias. If there, that was one of the concerns that was mentioned there being a political bias introduced. That could be there, but um, if it's overseen by the court, then you would expect there to be, you would hope there'd be some kind of neutrality here and some fairness in that regard.
Yeah. So according to this article, there have only been 9 federal takeovers of jails
Right.
in US history. So I guess since the late 1970s when this began. But
Those are complete takeovers, right? So we're not talking a federal takeover of the jail completely, even though a few lawyers might have called for it, but that's not what's on the table here, right?
right, although you may classify that, I guess, in some sense, because you're talking about a federal receiver with broad discretion, at least per the
Right.
plaintiff's proposal here, right? They're given a
Right.
lot of authority under
Right.
the plan. And you have a law professor quoted in this article, Hernandez D. Stroud, a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. He says, receivership litigation strikes at the heart of democratic governance. He says, in some cases, the person comes from outside the system. Other times, the government official is chosen. In 2 cases, the receiver had complete authority, essentially replacing the local government officials. In other
Mhm.
instances, some local government control remained. And so we do have to emphasize that these are just proposals that have been submitted to the court at the
Right.
behest of the judge. And so it's very possible that the judge takes some from plan A and some from plan B and comes up with their own solution
Right.
here.
Sure.
I would say that's probably likely. And maybe that's why, just from a legal strategy standpoint, both sides here are proposing what seem to be drastic ideas or drastic measures in either direction. Maybe they both realize that they're going to argue one way, the other side is going to argue the other way, and so what comes out at the end will be a mix of both. And maybe then to try to get more of what they want in, they're going to ask for more, knowing that it's going to be watered down.
Right. Sure. I think it's also worth mentioning, even though, it seems like, at least from my end, that the receivership in this way proposed is the better option. It is worth mentioning, and it's mentioned in this article, that receiverships often have mixed results, right? So California prisons have been under receivership for like over 20 years, and they still got issues. DC, Alabama prisons also, and they're still having unconstitutional conditions found. So this doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be successful either.
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that maybe gets us to the poll question we were going to ask, right? Because you know they are proposing these different ideas for fixing the chaos, as New York Times describes it. There are many out there who believe that it is unfixable, right? It's beyond repair at this point. And so That's the poll question we wanted to put out to the people for this week. So for all those out there, the poll question of the week is, do you believe the conditions at Rikers Island are beyond repair? We know here in New York City, they've been discussing closing Rikers for some time, and that's been a very controversial topic, right? Because the immediate follow-up question is, well, if you close it, what do you replace it with? Now, there have been proposals for borough jails, and you have a lot of protests from within the boroughs, within the neighborhoods, who don't want to see those jails, right? People will say it's on Rikers for a reason. It's an island and it's kind of shielded from the neighborhoods. Then
Right.
there's talk that many people are pushing for this idea, right? Let's close Rikers entirely, because the push is really coming from the real estate lobby that wants to develop that land. And I know some of those forces certainly have been aligned with those interests, say the least. So that could be part of this as well. You know, my thought on this has always been, you got to do something. So to me,
Sure.
the idea of, well, just close it is not really getting you to the
Yeah.
solution that you need. I mean, that
Yeah.
you got to do something, and people got to go somewhere, right? And so, yeah, so do you close it and then uh, so you continue the system, but just in borough-based jails? But are you sure that that's going to rectify the issues that existed there in the first place? I mean, when you would ask those types of questions, you would get answers like, well, right now they're on an island, and so they're kind of left to their own devices. Really? It's not like it's in the middle of like the Pacific Ocean, like the island of Samoa or something.
Right. There's still laws, there's still
Right.
rules that they're supposed
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
following.
and there's and by the way, you can still drive onto it,
Right,
right?
right,
The
yeah.
bridge. So what are you really talking about? I never really bought that rationale. You can
I,
close it, but if you do, you're still going to have the issues that existed. I mean, now clearly there are other issues maybe that could be rectified by that. Like for example, if the facilities are all old and decrepit, okay, maybe now you'll get newer state of the art facilities. That's part of it, but that's really not the only issue that you deal with Rikers.
no, it's clearly a culture issue. A culture issue among management there. Not just there, but in I'd say, every agency that has any sort of connection to it, even going up to the mayor's office, because it's been allowed to go on like this for so long. So it's clearly a culture issue. That's what needs to change. It doesn't matter if you shut it down, you do borough prisons. If the culture is still the same, you're going to have the same issues in different places. You're just going to have multiple places for those issues. So that's the real thing that needs to be fixed here,
Right.
in my opinion.
And I would say work on improving the system, meaning not only the conditions at Rikers, but the criminal justice system at large. When we get down
Yes,
to issues like the right to a speedy trial, right?
absolutely.
That's a resources problem, or whatever it is. But you need to be able to make sure that people can do that, right? So no one is just sitting on Rikers for years or for an exceedingly long time. Wasn't there a guy who was it? This guy's name, Khalif
Leaf
Browder?
Broward. Yeah.
Broward? Yeah, committed suicide, right? Wasn't the one who was accused of stealing a backpack and then committed suicide after because he was so depressed from being on Rikers for so long?
Right. He spent 3 years in Rikers without a trial. And it was just for stealing a backpack, I believe it was. And
Yeah.
I think wasn't it after he got out, he committed suicide?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, these are
There's
situations
you
you
should
want to
not
avoid,
be
and you should be able to avoid.
you should not be in a jail anywhere for 3 years for
Yeah.
stealing a backpack.
Right.
That period is something that shouldn't happen, regardless of if it's Rikers or if it's a local borough jail or a Mayberry police station with Andy Griffith. It should not happen
Yeah.
for stealing a backpack. There's no way that to me isn't either intentional or evidence of a serious failing in the system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this goes back to, I think, why the city was held in contempt of court, right? For its failure to address these conditions that have been identified in this lawsuit.
Right. So it's
So there was a consent decree or a settlement, right, where basically it's been acknowledged that something needs to be done, but now we are at the stage of fighting over, well, what it, what needs to be done, or how does that look if there's a receivership?
Right.
How does that look? And so we'll see, right? Again, like much else, TBD. We'll see what the court does here. My guess
Right.
again be probably somewhere in between these two proposals, and I do think I agree largely with you that the first one seems more appropriate than the second one on balance, but I think there are potential concerns with both of them. And at the very
Sure.
least, I would want to look closer into it. Now, I mentioned I think there's been like 1,000-page report issued, so I'm sure there's plenty I can read up on if I want to see more specifics on this. We're just going by this recently released New York Times article, but I'm sure the court will be taking a very close look at all of these things.
We hope so.
Yeah, yeah. I have faith that they'll look at that closely, given how involved this particular court has been with this case. Right? We mentioned that one judge has been working on this case for almost 10 years now, so
Right.
very invested in it, and hopefully we'll take a close look and look to make sure that for example, if they are going to appoint a receiver with broad discretion, union rights not being trampled. I mean, that is important too, and so
Sure.
hopefully the
Sure.
solution
But I
hopefully
think
the solution that emerges serves as many people as possible, in a positive way, right? You achieve what you want to achieve without trampling the rights of unions, local governments, employees, etc.
I think more above that, though, the rights of those being detained need to be considered
Well,
more than somebody's job position.
sure, but that, I mean, that is though the crux of what this
Yeah.
is, right? These are proposals, or at least the court asked for proposals on how to address these issues, because rights were violated, have been violated,
Yeah.
are being violated, right?
Right.
And so that is why we're in the situation that we're in. So the question becomes, when you come up with your solutions, when you make your proposals to deal with that, to address that, how do you do so in a way that doesn't infringe on other rights, right? And make the situation inadvertently worse in some other ways.
Right. Yes, I think that's yeah, I agree with that. What I don't like about that, without it being explicitly said, I think it needs to be explicitly said that if those other rights are in place and trampling on the human rights
Mm-hmm.
of those being detained, then those rules need to be overruled. So,
Yeah,
and what I mean is there could be a case where, the whatever the negotiation is with the union is really unfair for the humanity and the human rights of the people that are in the Rikers jails. Those would be invalid to me. I think I think the rights of the people that are being detained there to be safe, to be, you know, all of those things, those constitutional rights supersede somebody keeping their jobs, having their job security, in my opinion.
sure, but there could be constitutional rights on the other side as well. Or
I don't, I think the Constitution would supersede, in my opinion, would supersede that because we're talking about their rights and their life. Like, for example, uh, and this might not be a direct one-to-one comparison. For example, some states have 100% occupancy rules with private prisons,
mm,
right? Where they guarantee that these prisons have to be filled, or there's some penalty for the state. And so in making sure that happens, there will probably be some sort of civil rights or constitutional right violation or trampling to make sure that that is achieved to fulfill that contract.
yeah,
I think that is something that would not need to be considered when you're talking about uh, rehauling the system.
you're right. I agree, but I think there's a way to put this together that doesn't impede on anyone's constitutional rights. I mean, the New York State Constitution does guarantee strong union protection, like collective bargaining and all that
Sure,
kind
sure.
of stuff. So I don't think you need to put a plan in place that destroys that. I think you can do it in a way that it respects everyone's right.
You would hope so. You would hope so. Um, yeah.
So, yeah, we'll see what the court says. We'll see what the people say about Rikers Island. Is it beyond repair? You know, I did visit Rikers and I heard stories. You know, I really didn't see with my own eyes
Hmm.
the problems that were identified, right? But I was able to speak with inmates and I did hear things from them.
Right.
So, you know, clearly, as you mentioned, this has been going on for a long time and something needs to be done, right? So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. And did I miss the poll question?
I did put out the poll, but we had a poll from last time we want to go over, right?
We did. We did have a poll from last time. Um, and so our poll from last time, let me get it here. Well, when I put the poll up, I had to slightly revise the question because from when we created the poll question we had was, do you believe former Governor Andrew Cuomo should join the race for New York City mayor? At that point, he hadn't joined the race.
So
By
you
the time when I got to,
can
yeah, I had to change it to, do you think he should have joined the race for New York City mayor? Because that time he had already done it. So, Cuomo could have you could have gave us a heads up before the episode that you were coming in so that we could get it proper, but we'll let you go this time. So that was the question. Do you think he should have joined the race for New York City mayor? And so, what do you think the results are here on this? Just curious. So the yes, no were the choices. Yes, he should have. No, he shouldn't have.
I'm going to guess, even though I think he's doing well in New York City now, I'm going to
Hmm.
guess on this particular poll, 85% said no.
You're very close. 77% said no. 23% said yes. Yeah. And I gave I gave some background info on what was happening here. So we got some comments as well. This guy said no. He's like, what is this? There are only like 10 people in the world who can run for elective office. And I think that's a point. Like we keep seeing the same faces over and over again, shuffling around from position to position. And we've seen it at the presidency. I mean, we went from what was it? From Obama Biden to Trump to Biden to back to Trump. We saw, Hillary tried to get in the race several times over and over, Bernie several times. There was Reagan, Bush, and then Bush presidency, then Bush's son, then Bush's other son tried to run. Like,
Now you got
you know,
George P. Bush floating around.
who's George P. Bush?
Yeah, he's a thing. Look him up.
He's another Bush?
He certainly is. Another, I think he's Jeb's son.
Oh, yeah, Jeb tried to run.
Yeah.
So
You got
this
Grover
guy said,
Cleveland. Your man Grover Cleveland running 3 times in a row.
yeah. So this guy was like, I thought Cuomo was a megalomaniac. Now everything's relative, but at least he has tendencies in that direction. I don't think he was a strong leader during COVID. No, I did think he was a strong leader during COVID. I don't know what to think about the nursing home thing, but even with the former, I didn't really like him and don't understand. Um, so he does not want Cuomo in the race, or he doesn't think he should. Um,
You know, I think some of this is not just a political thing. Some of this is a human thing. Maybe it's more of an American thing, even. I don't know. But this idea of someone coming out with big name recognition, like the star quality, if you will, right? Like you see it in other forms of media as well, right? Because you might think, I don't know, why can't we have new people winning Oscars, for example, or winning Grammys, or you know what I mean, big
right.
superstars. And of course, you'll have new people come up here and there, but then you've got people who kind of have like a lifetime pass, right? If they were a big star once, they can drop whenever they want and automatically be given that huge reception. I see an analog in some sense to politics when someone comes out, like in a case like this, Cuomo joins the race. Oh, here's a big name we all know. We all, oh shoot. Everyone's
Right.
almost like starstruck over it. It's almost like
Sure.
he's like one of the made men in that genre, if you know what I mean. Like that's kind of how it feels to me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think in all of this, in all of that, there's an element of that popularity contest and everything. And it's also in recognition, you know.
Right. Right.
The devil you know, right? You're comfortable with who you know and what you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And so people tend to move in that direction. And that's why things like branding is so popular,
Exactly.
even personal branding, because it gives people more familiar with you, which makes them more likely to interact, engage, or take
Yeah.
on your services. So
Yeah. Think about that, right? Like that commenter's point about where there are only a couple people in the world who can run for office. It would be like going to a restaurant and they say, you got Coke or Pepsi, and it's like, oh, you tell me there's only two sodas in the world or on soda companies, but like those are the main ones. I thought like this is the name
yeah,
recognition, it's the market share, it's all that. So,
yeah. Shout out to RC Cola.
right. So, and I think part of this though can be misleading when it comes to politics, especially when it comes to New York City's mayor's races, right? Because I think we mentioned this on the show before. Anthony Weiner was leading from name recognition when he ran in 2013. Andrew
Sure.
Yang was coming off a presidential run, and he was leading when he ran in 2021 until he wasn't. And so I think when you're doing
I think he was leading off of that universal basic income. Everyone wanted a piece of that.
but it was, yeah, but he didn't win the president's,
Right, right, right.
right? He had a dropout, but he had the name recognition. And yeah, obviously he had some popularity still, but he didn't end up winning. He came nowhere close to winning the race when it was all said and done. And so
Right.
I think when you start polling people early on in a race, who would you support for mayor, right? They're not paying attention as closely until towards the end. And
Right.
so you just list a bunch of names they may not have heard about most of the people on the list. They're going to pick the person that they've heard about. And
Sure.
that's why someone like Cuomo would do very well early on in polls. Now that he's officially in the race and all the other candidates are turning their attention to attacking him, those numbers are sure to shift.
Absolutely.
Will it be enough for him to lose? Maybe, maybe not. But it's not going to stay
Right.
static. I think the huge lead he had early on was primarily due to name recognition, and like this person wrote in the comments, the fact that he was received as a competent governor during COVID.
Sure, sure. And like I said, I think, yeah, things change between that initial time and later on. I think the more, his opponents are going to attack him on some of the negatives and why he resigned before, and people are going to get reminded of these things, and those numbers are going to definitely shift. There was a comment here in response to the poll saying, why not? He does have experience as a manager. He made some mistakes as governor, but name someone who hasn't. Big complex cities like New York City are almost unmanageable. And if a former governor is willing to take on that job, I say give him a chance. I bet he'd be much better than the corrupt person they have now.
Yeah, although there are other candidates in the race who are trying to paint Adams and Cuomo as both corrupt, right? And they're
Right.
portraying them as two peas in a pod, and they're saying we want to move away from that. Adams was asked, does he believe Cuomo should be automatically disqualified for the nursing home scandal? Right? A lot of people said
Right.
that he was responsible for COVID deaths in nursing homes during the pandemic.
Right.
Um, to his credit, I think Adams answered the question correctly. He said, no, I don't think he should be automatically disqualified. I think that should be questioned on the campaign trail, and he should have to answer for that. He said, I think people should be asking, what have I done? What has he done? What are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses? Which I think is true, right? Let's have the campaign play out, and hopefully all of these issues will be litigated.
Right. Um, this person brought up this person said, those of us who live in New York State already know that Cuomo is a vindictive a-hole. In the calamitous early weeks of the pandemic, he did present the appearance of concern and competence while Tangerine Caligula was spewing lies. However, he also corruptly steered precious early COVID-19 tests to his family members when thousands were dying. That's more than enough for me to disqualify him forever.
Right. And so there are people who have these views, and I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll be hearing a lot of that as the weeks and months go on here leading up to the primary. The question becomes, if not Cuomo, then who? Is it
Right.
Lander? Is it Scott Stringer? now we're hearing Speaker Adams, right? Adrienne Adams is looking more likely to get into the race. She just gave her big address earlier today, right? State of the city, whatever she calls it. And it seemed like she was campaigning for mayor a little bit in her speech, right? Talking about, we need a strong leader in the city, that kind of thing. So she filed paperwork as well to run. So while she hasn't officially announced it, it looks like she's moving in that direction. And will she cut into Cuomo's base? We mentioned last week that Cuomo enjoys popularity primarily amongst Black voters in places like Southeast Queens. That is Adrienne Adams' base. That's her district in the city council. And so, how will that shape the dynamics of the race? If she's cutting directly into his base, who will benefit the most from that? Then you've got the ranked choice voting factor to consider, right? Even if she does pull from him, if she doesn't do enough, right? Let's say she only ends up with 20% or something like that and gets eliminated. Well, then her votes could still end up going to Cuomo at the end of the day. So, a lot of things can happen here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, yeah, one of those things are gonna, TBD again, have to see how this all plays out over this time until election day.
Yeah. Did you catch that DC 37 debate?
I did. I watched, well, I didn't get through all of it. I watched probably about three-fourths of it. I missed the last quarter, but you know, it was very dull. It was very uneventful and uninteresting. Um, there was a little bit of performative action in the beginning that kind of threw me off.
Okay. How so?
The way some of them introduced themselves, it was like clearly like this is not Comic-Con. Like, come on, chill out. Like, you know,
They were too over the top.
it's a couple of people seem to be that way.
Hmm.
Um, and so just like, wow, that was really cheesy.
Okay. But you also said dull. So that doesn't sound dull.
Well, just the yeah, dull. It was just kind of, I don't know, just kind of boring to to be honest. I did think to me the two that came off the most interesting that had that seemed to be the have the stronger opinions or more something that I gravitated to was I forgot his name, but he was a former Obama administration official.
Michael Blake.
Right, him. I liked the way that he addressed the questions. I liked his ideas. I liked his commanding authority when he spoke. I think of anyone on there, as far as commanding authority, he had the most of that.
Wow.
And what was the other guy that we talked about, I believe, last week? I think from the Bronx.
No, he's from Queens, from Astoria. Zoran Mandami.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So he seemed to come off pretty well.
I thought he spoke very well. I thought he was probably the most dynamic speaker. And I also thought that he was able to make himself appear presentable or palatable to
Mm,
a broader electorate than he probably represents given his policies, right? He was smart enough, and this honestly surprised me a little bit because I thought he was going to be one of those uh, rah rah, I'm a DSA socialist, far left guy, and I don't care what people think. I don't care if it's not popular. I'm going to say it because this is who I am. I thought that's what he was going to do because he's kind of been like that before,
mm,
at least when it came to him running for local office, right? Because he's in the assembly in Queens. So
mm.
I thought he was going to be, I'm going to keep it. By the way, also former MC. So I thought he was going to be, I'm going to keep it real kind of guy. And maybe he sees his campaign as surging and maybe he thinks he has more of a realistic shot now. And he is actually trying to appeal to voters who aren't exclusively in that lane, right? Because that's a very limiting
Right.
lane, especially when you're talking about running for New York City mayor. You want to try to build coalitions. That's
Right.
been a big knock, I think, on people in that lane. They don't do that. They subtract, but they don't add. So
Right.
it did seem like he was trying to add in
Yeah.
philosophy, right? At least in the way he presented his answers. Now, to be fair to him, I don't think he was moderating his positions necessarily. I don't think he said anything that went contrary to where he stood on any issue before. But in the way he answered the questions. He did it in an artful way where if you were watching and you didn't really know where he stood on the ideological spectrum, you probably still wouldn't know. You would actually maybe even assume he was more to the middle than he is
So he
based.
tempered his responses to compared to who he normally is.
Yeah, yeah, and he left out certain points, right? He never called himself a socialist once. He never
Right.
talked about some of his more controversial plans. He did kind of speak in broad strokes a little bit, but I think he did it in a way that sounded reasonable,
It
right?
kind of seemed like a lot of them spoke in broad strokes,
Yeah,
in
because
my opinion.
you're trying to win a Democratic primary for New York City mayor, and so I think you want to
Right.
avoid landmines, right?
Sure, sure. I don't recall hearing any specifics though on a lot of things, or they were very few,
Right, right.
you know.
Yeah, and that is something that I have not been happy about, right? I've always wanted to see more of that in general. But
Right.
I think there's also a calculation that candidates often make that that's going to go over people's heads, or they're not going to care about that, or they're going to come up too wonky, too whatever, right? Too
Sure,
technical.
sure.
And so they want to speak in aspirational tones, right? Like
Right.
you ask them, what is your plan for XYZ? And then they're just like, when I'm mayor, there'll be sunshines and rainbows. Like you're not really getting to the specifics of the
Right.
plan.
Right. And that, yeah, that t turns me off,
Yeah,
right? Because it's like, okay, now you're blowing smoke up my butt. Like I can see through this. I want to hear what you got planned. Get to the meat of it, you
sure,
know.
sure. But does that also
But
make a point about how the voters are? I mean, we want to hear that, but
right, right.
they're doing what has been proven to work,
Sure.
right?
And that's what I'm saying. Yeah. On the flip side,
Yeah,
right. That's what people seem to respond to, unfortunately. And, I mean, Trump took the White House off of that, and that's been his whole thing, basically. And most politicians kind of tend to do that.
right.
So,
Yeah, and that is the stereotype, right? That politicians speak in platitudes and never really answer a
sure,
question because they don't want to
absolutely,
piss anyone off, right? So they're always being generic and giving
absolutely,
an answer. So, they don't want to give a great answer except for this one thing that they said that will now become the whole story, end up on the
right,
cover of the newspaper, and everything else they said doesn't get heard because they said one thing that upset some group somewhere.
right,
So
absolutely,
that
yeah.
is definitely a factor. Yeah, yeah, I've noticed that a lot too. But what does it say about voting? I mean, should voters, on the whole, be demanding more?
Yes, and I think that's and we've talked about it before. I mean, in a democracy, there is a responsibility on the citizenry, right? To be informed, to understand the issues, take part in that. You know, these politicians, whether they're doing good jobs or bad jobs, can't really do that if the people are paying attention at the highest level and taking action in that regard, right? Because people wouldn't get voted back in and all this type of thing. Um, so people, I think that's one of the failings that we have in our society, currently, is that we're checked out a lot. And it's not completely the people's fault because life is such a burden on their shoulders
Right.
that, their day to day is kind of preventing them from giving as much attention as they might need to.
Right. Right. And so when you get a question like, I don't know, how will you address the donut hole in the budget with respect to this, this, and this? And then someone gets up there and he says, well, when I'm mayor, Vice President Adams will not have a say. And everyone starts cracking up. Like that's like the best answer he can give, not
Right.
addressing the actual question being asked, but that's what they know. It almost
Right.
feels like there was the biggest pop from the crowd whenever Adams or Trump or someone like that, even Cuomo was mentioned, right? The big names, as opposed
Right.
to getting into like the meat and potatoes of the questions.
Right. That reminds me of did you ever see the episode of Family Guy? And I believe it was Lois was running for mayor
Mm-hmm.
and she had no policy positions, nothing whatsoever, and she's in a town hall debate and every question that was answered to her, that was asked to her, her response was 9/11.
I didn't
That's
see.
all she said. She didn't say anything else.
Yeah.
Any question, she's like 9/11. The crowd just goes crazy
Right.
and she ends up, winning out of it.
Yeah, yeah, I did see that. Yeah.
So that's kind of
That's
how stuff
back
works.
to I think what we originally were talking about here about the name recognition, kind of the
Yeah,
star power, right? Star power of some of these, and maybe that's why this debate seemed a little dull because your stars weren't there. There was no Adams and no Cuomo, and no
that
other
could be.
Adams, right?
That could be.
They certainly have taken all the oxygen out of the room here, and
Right.
when their names, I mean, that tells you something, right? They weren't there, but when their names were mentioned by the people who were there, that's when you got the most reaction, for better or for worse. People
And
made the most noise.
yeah, and another thing that kind of struck me for this, and maybe that kind of played to the boringness of it. There was a little bit of disingenuousness to it. Um, because this was a debate that was taking place in front of a particular union.
Right.
So there was a lot of platitudes
All about
to,
the unions.
yeah, there was a lot of platitudes to the unions that was just like, it's so obvious that that's what they were doing. And
Yeah,
that just like, okay,
they
I'm
have to do it because they're
yeah,
there not just for a union audience, but it was really a forum about whom was going to get the union's endorsement. It was a
right,
D7 endorsement forum. And so, yes, I agree with you. And it does come off very transparent. But if they don't do it, I think it's
right,
even worse for them, right? Because it's like, how come everyone kissed our ass by that guy?
right. Absolutely, absolutely. And so like that was, I think it would be a better measure of these candidates if they had a more neutral and public debate.
Well,
Um,
they will. They're going
yeah,
to be
sure.
present at other debates. Yeah. So this
Yeah,
was just one that we were able to watch on YouTube. Interestingly, we mentioned Mayor Adams not being there. He was advised by his counsel
right.
not.
Yeah.
How
I
crazy is
like
that?
how that was called out though.
Yeah, I think someone even said I was advised by my counsel to be here.
Right. And
Yeah,
then someone called out like I think you should ask for you should be looking for a mayor who can attend a debate and doesn't have to be restricted by counsel to speak. And I
right.
thought that was a great point.
The implication there being that if he debates, he's subjecting himself to criminal liability by answering
Right.
questions at the debate. I mean, that's really crazy.
Right, right. I thought that was a really good point. I don't remember who brought that up, but I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah,
I think it was one of the,
yeah,
I'm sorry?
a few of them did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I thought that was really good. But
Now, Adams' response is, well, I'm not going to show up until all of the candidates are in the field. So he's waiting for Cuomo and Adrian Adams and all. But will that change his attorney's advice, right? Will his attorney still tell him, hey, listen, you still can't show up because you're going to get these questions? And,
right,
if you answer the questions on the debate stage, maybe that indictment ends up coming back.
right. Or, it's not really going to help you if you get on the debate stage and say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that on advice of my counsel. That's
Right.
going to send a
Plead the
message as
fifth.
well.
Imagine that. Plead the fifth at a debate.
Yeah, that's going to send a message as well. It's not going to help your campaign. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, Adams has a tough road ahead. That's for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Adam should contact us, get on here, see what he can answer. He probably won't be able to answer a lot of the questions anyway.
Yeah. Did you ever see the deposition of Trump from a couple of years ago now, where at first all of his answers were something like, on the advice of my counsel, I am not going to answer this question. And it was like almost like a paragraph that they gave him, a couple sentences to say, I'm
Mhm.
invoking my Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate myself, and blah, 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 blah. And he just kept repeating that same thing over and over and over again. And eventually the lawyer said, to make it easier on you, you can just say same answer. And this will go a lot quicker. Just say same answer. And he was like, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Same answer. Same answer. Because he wanted to read that whole paragraph every single time.
And no, I didn't see that one, but
It was
you
funny.
know,
He was grateful to the attorney for allowing him to just say same answer.
yeah, right. I think we do have to talk about the since with Trump and Zelensky in the White House, which has really left the world kind of reeling this past week with that I don't want to I guess argument is the word. To me it was more like a berating instead of an argument. Um It was distasteful. It was disgusting. It was a mafia shakedown, and it was frankly beneath the United States, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Um, and you know, I saw a video recently that said, basically it puts the U.S. on the side of the bad guys in this situation, and that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Even though we can debate all of the things that, America does as far as meddling in foreign policy and other governments, but this I think is going to have a lot of implications for foreign policy and connections with our allies
Yeah, yeah,
going forward,
yeah, definitely.
because this signaled to them that one, we've basically sided with Russia. He refused to say anything about Russia's invasion. He berated Zelensky, a leader that is currently defending his nation from invasion, and is an ally who we had obligations, responsibilities to. And so other allies who we have obligations, responsibility to are going to be questioning whether they can rely on the United States going forward
Right.
in situations that might call for help or call
Yeah.
for,
And I think
activity.
sometimes people underestimate the danger that can put us in and put the whole world in. Because
Yes.
I know there are many, and a lot of this is justified. They don't like that the United States has played world policeman as much as it has,
Sure.
right? And that
Absolutely.
to take a step back when it comes to that. But I think people need to keep in mind that a lot of our foreign policy over the past decades, while it may seem aggressive in some instances, has really served to prevent countries, especially countries that we consider dangerous to our interest, from developing, for example, nuclear power, right?
Right.
From really building their arsenals up to a potentially catastrophic level. And
Right.
so, it's not an easy situation by any means, right? I think there's a
Right.
line to walk there, but
Sure.
we need to keep in mind that the U.S. kind of has played that role, right, with
Right.
our foreign policy. We've been tough where needed because in some case or on some level, it really has prevented the breakout of World War III.
Right. And for example, with Ukraine, when the USSR, Soviet Russia fell, and there was that break apart. Ukraine had the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world. And one of the things that we got together with them, along with the new Russia and other allies, was to have them give up their nuclear stockpile in exchange for some guarantees, protection guarantees. And that was an effort to deproliferate nuclear weapons in the world, which makes us all safer. And so they did that. They gave up their nuclear arsenal. They had the third largest behind the US and Russia. And they gave up all of that with these guarantees that one, we would help out, two, that their sovereignty would be respected. Um, and so we have those obligations in place, and that again made people safer. You know, Putin has violated that obviously. But there's we have to keep a lot of different things in mind. So
Right, right. And I think that's the problem. Hey, maybe we're starting to find the bottom line here, right? Things are becoming oversimplified to a dangerous degree.
yeah, I think they definitely are. And again, it's there's so much that happens, stuff that goes on behind the scenes and in front that, people got their own lives to deal with, so some things can get lost, but we have to be willing to hear what's out there instead of just judging based on whatever our feeling is. Like you mentioned, people are kind of sick of, even Americans can be kind of sick of this idea that the US is playing world police and using our tax dollars and our soldiers to do it. But we have to keep in mind what the implications of that is, what kind of situations that might be a part of, what people are requesting, and what obligations we might be under. So we have to keep a lot of these different things in mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it seems like we live in an age where people don't want to look for the nuance in situations. I mean, that's, I guess, why we do what we do here. But
Yeah.
something that we battle on multiple fronts, right? Everyone wants to reduce it to a soundbite or a tweet, as opposed to looking at these issues for what they are, which are very complicated issues. And oftentimes the solution isn't all or nothing, right? It's usually there's usually a thread to needle there. Is that the way to say it?
Needle to thread?
A needle to thread? No, I think there's a thread to needle.
I don't think I've heard that phrase, but I'm just thinking you thread the needle.
You
So a
thread the
needle to
needle.
thread. Yeah.
There's a
I think
needle
it's
to
opposite.
thread? Oh,
I
okay.
think it's opposite.
The needle, there's a thread to needle. Okay. Yeah, you're right. I don't know. They both sound right to me.
Point taken.
Right.
Point
The
taken.
needle point.
Right. A needle point taken. So yeah, that's where it is. So what people should do is take part in some nuanced conversations and be willing to admit when you don't know everything. And maybe what you knew was incorrect and it's time to change it, you know.
Yeah.
I actually had a discussion recently this past week because obviously this stuff is what's been going on and people are talking about the misinformation that's out there about that was being perpetuated by, I believe it was JD Vance, talking about the US has given 350 million to 400 million dollars to the Ukraine, and we're the only ones doing the support, and all of it is categorically false. We have not given that much money. One, and I think this needs to be reiterated. We haven't given that much money. It's probably closer to half, 180 to 200 billion. Two, we didn't just write them a check. Imagine just sending them a check and they're going to cash USD. They can't go down to like the local, arms store and buy some tanks. It doesn't work like that. We're not the only ones that's given them funds. The Europe has given almost as much as we have. And primarily a large share of the money that we've allocated to help the Ukraine has been spent in America with American companies employing American workers because we're giving them our old weapons and using that money to build more modern weapons, which is refreshing and re-enhancing our military, so it's benefiting us. And even the decrepit turtle, Mitch McConnell, has went on the news multiple times and explained the situation. So we've got to make sure that we're not being misled and be willing to know when it's wrong or hear when something's wrong and change that opinion. So
Right, right. Well, hopefully people will start looking at things that way. I think you are starting to see some of the actions being taken as repulsive to people's values, even people who are supportive of the administration, right? They're saying, whoa, this is a bridge too far. And so hopefully we'll
right,
start to see more people being able to look at things from multiple angles and not look at it like it's got to be everything or nothing, right? Like you're
right.
supporting your team all the way here. Like, no, we're trying to come up with solutions to very serious problems.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right. Well, do we have a bottom line here?
I think that was kind of a bottom line discussion instead of a specific
Yeah.
one take bottom line. Um, so I think that kind of suffices. And I think what's left is people can comment, take part in the discussion, subscribe to the channel, and follow us on socials. That's YouTube, that's Instagram. Engage on Reddit, and wherever podcasts are available. So get on board with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us. As always, we've got work to do, and we'll catch you next time.